They say that when a mother gives birth, she gives away not only her blood and her strength but also her future. I did not understand that when I was young. I thought motherhood meant lullabies, little hands clutching my sari, and perhaps one day a child's success to hold as my reward. But now, in my old age, sitting in this dimly lit apartment where silence is heavier than air, I know the truth. Sometimes motherhood gives you nothing but scars. My name is Shanta, 71 years old, a widow for more than 2 decades. My life has been lived within the narrow lanes of this city, lanes that choke with smoke and dust by day and fall eerily quiet by night. These walls have witnessed everything. My laughter as a bride, my struggles as a young mother, my loneliness as a widow, and most of all, they have witnessed my son Ravi. He was my only child, my only reason to rise every morning after my husband's sudden death. Ravi was just 10 then, still small enough to need my hand as he crossed the street, still young enough to cling to me in the night. I remember vowing, with my husband's body still warm on the funeral pyre, that I would raise him into a good man. I promised my dead husband and myself that I would pour every drop of my soul into this boy. I did. I worked endless hours stitching blouses for women wealthier than I would ever be. My back ached, my eyes burned from the needle, but I told myself, it is for Ravi, for his school fees, his clothes, his future. When other mothers scolded their sons for playing in the streets, I only smiled at him, thinking he deserved joy. When neighbors whispered that I spoiled him, I turned deaf, believing love was never a poison. But sometimes, love is poisoned. Ravi grew tall, clever, handsome. But with every year, I saw less of my little boy and more of my late husband's arrogance. He wanted more than I could give. He wanted the world, and he thought I owed it to him. Still, I obeyed. I told myself it was only a phase, that one day he would understand my sacrifices. That day never came. It was last winter when the storm broke. I remember the evening vividly. The city was shrouded in cold mist, the kind that seeps through even closed windows. My joints throbbed with pain, but Ravi had announced, casually, that he was bringing friends home for dinner. Just make soup and some snacks, he had said, as though my body were a machine that could be wound at will. I tried. God knows I tried. My hands shook as I chopped vegetables. The kerosene stove hissed angrily, and the pot was heavier than my arms could manage. The minutes slipped away faster than I could catch them. By the time his friends arrived, laughing, filling our modest living room with their city arrogance, the soup was still simmering. Ravi's eyes burned with embarrassment. "Where is it, Ma?" he demanded, his voice sharp. I stammered, explaining it needed just a few more minutes. His friends chuckled, one of them muttering something about old people moving like snails. And then it happened, the moment that cleaved my life into before and after. Ravi's hand rose with merciless and struck my cheek. The crack echoed louder than any thunder. For a heartbeat, the room fell silent. His friends looked at each other, half amused, half shocked, but none intervened. Stumbled back, clutching the counter for support. The taste of blood filled my mouth, my eyes blurred with tears, not just from the sting, but from the shattering of a lifetime's hope. My son, my only child, had raised his hand against me, and where she felt no shame. "Can't even do this one thing properly," he muttered, glaring at me, as though I were nothing but a servant. Then he turned back to his friends, laughing as if nothing had happened. I wanted to scream. I wanted to curse him, to tell him how many nights I had gone hungry so he could eat. How many blouses I had stitched until my fingers bled, just so he could wear good shoes, but the words never came. My throat locked, my heart shattered, and I stood frozen, like stone. That night, I did not sleep. I sat on the floor beside my bed, clutching the corner of my shawl, rocking back and forth like a woman possessed. The mark of his hand still burned on my face, but the wound inside burned hotter. I whispered into the silence, to my husband's absent soul, "Why, Anand? Why did you leave me with this boy? Is this what my life was meant to be?" But silence has no answers. And yet, deep in that silence, something stirred. A strange strength, born not of love but of betrayal. A strength that whispered, "Enough, Shanta, enough." For the first time in 71 years, I began to wonder not whether I had failed Ravi, but whether Ravi had failed me. And I decided that night, I would not remain silent forever, because, sometimes, even a mother must rise not for herself, but for the truth. And what happened next was something no one in this city could have imagined. The elderly mother has been struck by her son in front of his friends. Humiliated, broken, but stirred by a new strength, she begins to plan what comes next. Morning came, but it did not feel like morning. The sun rose behind a veil of city smog, the streets below filled with rickshaws honking, hawkers shouting, and children crying for school. Life moved on, but inside me something had stopped. I looked at the mirror, at the faint bruise blooming on my cheek. For years I had watched my face age lines deepening, skin sagging, but I had never seen it marked by my own child's hand. It was not just skin he had struck. He had struck my dignity, my motherhood, my very existence. Ravi avoided me that morning. He rushed off to work without a glance, leaving behind dirty plates and the smell of cigarette smoke his friends had left clinging to the room. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the unwashed soup pot. My hands trembled as I touched it, as though it held the ghost of last night. I wanted to weep, but no tears came. Instead, a strange calm spread through me, like a fire that had burned so long it no longer roared but smoldered, deep, steady, waiting. I thought of my neighbors, of the countless stories whispered behind closed doors, of old mothers mistreated by their children, of fathers abandoned in government hospitals, of parents forgotten in villages while sons built glass houses in the city. I used to pity them, thinking I was blessed because Ravi at least lived with me. But now I knew I was no different. I was one of them, perhaps worse, because I had built my entire life around one child, one hope, and now that hope had struck me down. Still, I was not ready to surrender. That afternoon, I stepped out of the flat. My knees ached, but I forced them down the narrow staircase. The city greeted me with its usual chaos: vegetable carts piled high with wilted greens, auto rickshaws belching smoke, women bargaining as though their lives depended on 2 rupees less. I blended into the crowd, one more old woman with a shawl wrapped tightly, clutching her purse close. But inside me, storms raged. I found myself walking to the temple, not because I expected gods to intervene, no. I had lost that kind of faith long ago, but because I needed silence. I sat on the cool stone steps, listening to the temple bell echo across the city. And for the first time in years, I spoke aloud, to myself. What am I now? A servant? A burden? My voice cracked. Or still a mother? An old priest walked by, his eyes kind but tired. He paused briefly, as though he wanted to speak, then only nodded and moved on. Perhaps he saw the battle in my face. Perhaps he knew it was not his place to interfere. That night, Ravi returned home drunk. His laughter filled the flat as he stumbled in, muttering about work stress, about how his friends had praised his hospitality. He looked at me as though nothing had happened, as though the slap had been erased from memory. But I remembered. My cheeks still remembered. He asked for food. I served him without a word. He did not notice the silence, or perhaps he did and chose to ignore it. Either way, I saw clearly what my life had become: cycle of servitude, my sacrifices invisible, my love trampled. And so, I began to plan, not revenge. I was too old for vengeance, but justice. A way to show my son what he had become, and what I had endured. I started small. I stopped rising at dawn to cook elaborate meals for him. I gave him simple food, enough to fill his stomach but without the affection I once poured into every dish. I stopped waiting at the window for him to return at night. I stopped fussing over his clothes. At first, he did not notice. Then he grew irritated. "What's wrong with you, Ma? You're becoming lazy," he said one evening, tossing his shirt on the chair. I bit back my words, but inside, my resolve hardened. Days passed, and my quiet rebellion grew. I visited the women in the neighborhood, women like me, who whispered stories of their ungrateful children. We sat together on verandas, sharing tea and sorrow, and in their company, I found strength. We were not alone, we were many, and slowly, a thought formed in my mind: dangerous, daring, but impossible to ignore. If Ravi would not see my worth as his mother, then perhaps the world would. Perhaps it was time to show everyone, to strip away the mask he wore outside, the mask of the dutiful son, the successful man. One evening, I found myself writing. My hands shook, my eyes strained, but I wrote page after page. I wrote of my sacrifices, of the hunger I had endured, of the slap that had shattered me. I wrote, not as a victim, but as a witness. I wrote the truth. I did not know yet what I would do with those pages, but as I finished each line, my heart grew lighter. For the first time in years, I was no longer silent, but silence, once broken, has consequences because the night Ravi discovered my writing hidden beneath my pillow. The storm that followed was one the city would never forget. The elderly mother has begun secretly writing her story of sacrifice and abuse, finally breaking her silence. But her son is about to discover it, and his reaction will change everything. It was a night heavy with humidity, the kind that makes even the walls sweat. I had finished my prayers and tucked the notebook under my pillow before lying down. Writing had become my quiet rebellion, my only breath of freedom. Each word I scribbled felt like a wound stitched closed, a pain eased, a truth finally spoken. But truth has a way of rising, like steam from boiling water. You can try to trap it, but it will always find escape. Ravi came home later than usual that night. His footsteps were loud, uneven, half anger, half drunken swagger. I closed my eyes, pretending to sleep, but a mother's ears are sharper than she admits. I heard him muttering, heard the clatter of his shoes hitting the floor, and then the rustle of my pillow. My heart dropped. I wanted to sit up, to stop him, but my body betrayed me. I stayed frozen, praying he would overlook it. But his fingers brushed against the notebook, and in an instant, it was gone. The sound of pages flipping cut through the silence. "What is this?" His voice was thick, venomous. I opened my eyes slowly. He stood over me, the notebook in his hands, his face twisted in fury. "You've been writing about me, about our family. Are you trying to shame me in front of the world?" I sat up, my shawl slipping from my shoulders. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt. "I was writing the truth, Ravi, my truth." His eyes darkened. For a moment, I saw not my son but a stranger, someone with my blood in his veins but no trace of my heart. "You think anyone cares about your truth?" he spat. "You think your suffering matters? You live under my roof. You eat from my earnings. And you dared to write filth about me." The sting of his words cut deeper than any slap. "Still, I refused to cower. I lived under this roof long before you did," I whispered, "and I fed you from my hunger. Do not forget that, Ravi." His nostrils flared. He slammed the notebook on the table, pages bending under his grip. For a terrible moment, I thought his hand would rise again, that he would strike me harder than before. But instead, he leaned closer, his voice low. "Dangerous. If you ever show this to anyone," he hissed, "I will make sure you regret it." Then he stormed into his room, leaving the notebook behind as though it were a bomb he didn't know how to defuse. I sat trembling, clutching the edges of my shawl. The warning in his voice echoed in my ears, but something inside me had shifted. Fear was still there, yes, but it no longer ruled me. The fire of betrayal had burned it away. That night, I did not sleep. I held the notebook in my lap and stared at the pages, wondering what to do. Should I destroy it, keep peace in the house, or should I finish it, even if it meant tearing open the fragile walls of my world? By dawn, I knew my answer. I would not destroy my truth. The following days were tense. Ravi moved around the house like a lion pacing its cage, suspicious, restless. He eyed me whenever I picked up a pen, and sometimes he even checked my drawers. But I grew cunning. I began hiding my writing in places he would never touch: inside flower tins, beneath old saris, in the folds of prayer books. Slowly, steadily, I added to my story, and as I wrote, I began to notice things I had ignored before: the emptiness in Ravi's laughter when he was with his friends, the bitterness in his tone when he spoke about work, the weight of debts he tried to hide but which leaked through in angry phone calls at night. My son was not just cruel, he was drowning, and instead of swimming, he dragged me down with him. One afternoon, when he was out, I took the notebook and walked again to the temple. I placed it at the feet of the deity, whispering, "Let this truth find light when the time is right." But fate does not wait for the time we choose. It strikes when it pleases. Because only a week later, when I thought my secret was safe, the neighborhood women gathered outside our building. Their voices were raised, urgent, curious. I stepped out, and one of them rushed to me, holding something in her hands. It was my notebook. The pages fluttered in the breeze, my words visible, my pain laid bare. Someone had found it near the temple, and now it had become the talk of the street. "Shantaji, did you really write this?" one woman asked, her eyes wide with pity and shock. I froze. The world spun around me. My truth exposed, raw, unstoppable, no longer mine alone. And as whispers spread through the neighborhood, I knew Ravi would hear of it soon. And when he did, the storm that followed would not just tear our home apart, but perhaps our very lives. The mother's secret writings about her abuse have been discovered and spread through the neighborhood. Her truth is now public, and Ravi's wrath is inevitable. By the time Ravi returned home that evening, the neighborhood had already shifted. I could feel it in the way people stared at me from the stairwell, in the way their whispers slithered down the walls. Word spreads like fire in dry grass. By now, every mouth within 3 lanes had chewed on my story. I sat on the wooden bench near the window, clutching my rosary, waiting. My chest rose and fell too fast, but my sigh forced it into stillness. When the door slammed open, I knew the storm had arrived. Ravi's eyes were bloodshot, not from drink this time, but from rage. He carried the notebook in his hand, the same one the neighbors had passed around like a cursed relic. He flung it onto the floor before me, the pages scattering like wounded birds. "So it's true," he said, his voice low, trembling with fury. "You wrote this filth about me. And now the whole city is laughing." I met his gaze. My lips trembled, but I spoke clearly. "I wrote the truth, Ravi. If the truth is shameful, then perhaps it is not me who should feel shame." His hand twitched, as though he would strike again, but something stopped him, perhaps the weight of the neighbors listening through the thin walls, perhaps the knowledge that his mask was already cracked. Instead, he paced, his anger spilling like hot oil. "You want to destroy me. After everything I do for you. After I feed you, house you." I cut him off, my voice sharp as glass. "Do not speak of feeding me. I fed you from my hunger. I sheltered you from my widow's earnings. This roof you claim as yours was built by my tears and stitches." For the first time in years, I saw the flicker of guilt in his eyes, but guilt, when mixed with pride, curdles into cruelty. "You've ruined me, Ma," he muttered, running his hands through his hair. "My colleagues will hear, my friends already mock me. Do you know what you've done?" I rose slowly, my joints protesting but my spirit firm. "Yes, I have shown the world the truth. What you do with it is your burden, not mine." He stared at me as though I had become a stranger. Perhaps I had. The silent, obedient mother he once knew was gone. In her place stood a woman weathered but unbroken, a woman who had nothing left to lose. That night, the house felt like a battlefield. He shut himself in his room, making furious phone calls, cursing under his breath. I remained in the living room, the notebook pressed against my chest, whispering prayers that were half pleased, half defiance. The following days were chaos. Some neighbors avoided me, fearing Ravi's temper. Others looked at me with new respect, even sympathy. A few women came quietly to my door, whispering, "You are brave, Shantaji. You said what we all wanted to say." Their words were balm to my wounds. For the first time, I realized my suffering was not just mine, it was a mirror of countless others. By speaking, I had not only freed myself but also given them a voice. Ravi, however, unraveled. He came home angrier, drunker. Each night, sometimes he shouted at me, other times he sank into brooding silence. The proud son who once strutted through the city with friends now walked with his head lowered, mocked behind his back. One evening his fury reached its peak. He stormed in, grabbed my notebook from the cupboard, and held it above the kerosene lamp. "I'll burn it," he threatened, his eyes wild. "I'll erase every word, and then no one will ever know." I stood before him, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "You can burn the pages, Ravi, but you cannot burn the truth. It is already in their eyes, on their tongues, in their hearts. Do you think fire can silence what they've seen?" His hand shook. For a moment, I thought he would drop it into the flame. But then he hurled it to the ground instead. The pages smudged with soot, but alive. He collapsed into the chair, burying his face in his hands. And then, to my shock, he wept. Not the soft tears of regret, but harsh, bitter sobs of a man cornered by his own reflection. I stood frozen, torn between the mother in me who wanted to comfort him and the wounded woman who knew he had brought this upon himself. I chose silence. The days after blurred into a strange quiet. Ravi avoided me, avoided the neighbors, even skipped work at times. I could see his pride crumbling, but I did not interfere. Sometimes the only cure for arrogance is the taste of its own downfall. And then, one morning, the police came. 2 officers stood at our door, their eyes hard. "We've had complaints," one said, "about domestic violence, about your son's behavior." Ravi's face turned white. He stammered, denying, pleading. but the officer's eyes shifted to me. Is it true, Oma? The room went silent. The air was heavy, waiting. My entire life had led to this single moment. I looked at my son, my blood, my burden, my betrayer, and then at the officers, who waited for my answer, and with a trembling breath, I opened my mouth. The police arrive after neighbors complain about Ravi's abuse. The mother is asked directly to confirm the truth. What she says next will decide both her fate and her son's. The officer's eyes drilled into me, waiting. Ravi's chest rose and fell in panic, sweat beading on his forehead. His lips moved, whispering half beg, half command. Say no, Ma. Tell them it's lies. For 71 years, I had carried silence like a second skin. I had buried my pain under obedience, under the illusion that sacrifice was the highest form of love. But now, with the police at my door and the weight of my entire life pressing against my chest, I knew silence had already cost me too much. I lifted my face, fragile yet unbending, and said clearly, yes, it is true. The words fell into the air like stones into water, rippling outward. Ravi gasped, his eyes widening as though I had stabbed him. The officers nodded grimly, stepping forward. One placed a hand on his shoulder, firm, unyielding. Rafi began to shout, she's lying, she's old, she's confused, you can't take her word. But his voice faltered under the officer's grip. The neighbors had gathered in the corridor, their faces peering through half-open doors, their whispers rising like a tide. I saw in their eyes both shock and something else, vindication. They had known pieces, glimpses. Now they knew the whole. The officers took him away that day, his protests echoing down the stairwell. I stood in the doorway, clutching my shawl, watching my only son dragged into the consequences of his own cruelty. My heart twisted not with joy, not with sorrow, but with a strange clarity. I had not destroyed him. He had destroyed himself. After he was gone, the neighbors came. Some offered sympathy, others awkward silence. But one by one, the women touched my hand. Their eyes filled with respect I had never seen before. You were brave, Shantaji, one whispered. You spoke for all of us. That night, for the first time in decades, I slept without fear. The apartment felt lighter, though emptier too. The silence was not suffocating anymore. It was peaceful. In the days that followed, I continued writing, not in secret anymore, not hidden under pillows or in flower tins. I wrote openly, my notebook resting on the table, pages filled with memories, lessons, warnings. My story was no longer just mine, it belonged to every parent abandoned by a child, every elder silenced by respect that was only skin deep. The city began to talk of me not as a burden, not as a helpless widow, but as a woman who had dared to speak. A local women's group invited me to share my writings with others. I sat among them, my voice trembling at first, then growing steady, as I read aloud the lines of my pain and survival. Some cried, some nodded, all listened. And slowly, I realized something profound. I had spent my life believing my worth was tied to my son, that without him, I was nothing. But in truth, I was more than a mother. I was a woman, a survivor, a voice. As for Ravi, he spent some weeks in custody, questioned, humbled. When he returned, he was quieter, thinner, his arrogance dulled. He could not meet my eyes. He mumbled apologies, words that might once have melted me, but I had moved beyond. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is releasing the hold of the wound. I forgave him not for his sake, but for mine. But the bond we once had, the blind devotion, was gone forever. He asked me one evening, Ma, will you ever see me the same again? I looked at him, my eyes, soft but firm. No, Ravi, and perhaps that is your punishment. He lowered his head, and I knew he understood. Now, as I sit by the window each morning, watching the city wake, I feel a strength I never knew in my youth. I am old, yes, my body aches, my hands tremble, but my spirit is unbroken. If anyone asks what happened, I tell them simply, my son hit me because I could not make soup on time, but what happened next was worth watching, because I found my voice. And in that voice lies the justice I had waited for my entire life. Ending lesson. Silence protects no one. Sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself, for others, is to speak the truth, no matter the cost. Respect is not owed to children simply because they are born. It is earned by how they treat the ones who gave them life.